because some people may be hearing this for the first time. Why does all this apply to us? Why are we so different? Why do we do these things that nobody else does? And just very briefly, it has to do with adoption. Paul has a line where he says that those who have accepted Yeshua as the Messiah, Jesus as the Christ, are adopted children of Abraham and heirs according to the promise. That promise is the promise to make Abraham an innumerable nation of people. So that's what actually grafts us in to Israel. We don't replace Israel, we join Israel. That means we get the blessings and the curses. That means we become part of that family, and so we have to abide by the family rules. So in the first century, first century Christianity, that's what the name is. In the first century, the faith was overwhelmingly Jewish for like a decade. After Yeshua ascended, it went out through the synagogues and through that system, and then they started to have Gentile people joining. And that's the problem that Paul went to Jerusalem to talk about in Acts 15, because there were Gentile people showing up at synagogue wanting to hear the Torah because they'd gotten the Holy Spirit and they wanted to learn about the true God. So they show up. Where do you hear about the true God? In the synagogue, right? So they're showing up, and then they have the meeting in Acts 15, and it says, okay, what are we supposed to do with these people? And they say, don't trouble them with circumcision, don't make them convert to Judaism, but they're going to attend synagogue every Sabbath and hear Moses. And so over time, they're learning as they hear the word, which is what we do here. And so that's why the first century, we even have Paul writing to a church saying, therefore, let us keep the feast, not with the unleavened bread of insincerity. He goes on with that. Paul even tells one of the congregations to continue keeping the feast, and he's talking about this one, the one that we're keeping today. So that's why all this stuff applies to us. And when it comes to the days of unleavened bread, we're really in a minority on this one. Even today is the Sabbath. It's also the first day of unleavened bread. It's a double Sabbath, and we'll get to the John 19:31 later. But in general, most of Christianity does something at this time of year to remember the death and resurrection of Jesus, right? Which it's good to do something. We just wish they would do the right thing and switch it up a couple of days and change their practices. But at least they're doing something. As I talked to somebody recently about a funeral, it was Terry. She had a funeral, and it was a Christian funeral, but at least the person was a believer, right? I mean, what's happened in this world is that people have turned away from any type of Christianity whatsoever in favor of, just made up stuff or whatever. And so it's great. And Judaism does something at this time of year in commemoration of the Exodus. So we're that intersection. We're the intersection between the two, that pivot point. And the days of unleavened bread tend to get short shrift. In Christianity, they get together and have hot cross buns. They actually have leavened bread exactly when they're not supposed to be doing that. And in Judaism, people will attend the Seder, if that, and that's about it. I mean, the amount of people who are actually de-leavening their houses and eating unleavened bread is pretty small. And then when you dwindle down to who's observing the first and last day of unleavened bread, the last day of unleavened bread is, I would say, the least attended holy day of people that believe like us. It shouldn't be. It's a commandment. It's the same weight on that day, the same gravity for that day as there is on Yom Teruah, on Feast of Trumpets. But people have a lot more pizzazz about trumpets, I guess. So with that, let's start taking a look at this stuff and diving in. Today's a teaching day. So in Deuteronomy 16, 1-8, observe the month of Abib and celebrate the Passover to Yahweh your Elohim. For in the month of Abib, Yahweh your Elohim brought you out of Egypt by night. You shall sacrifice the Passover to Yahweh your Elohim from the flock and the herd. in the place where Yahweh chooses to establish his name. You shall not eat leavened bread with it. 7 days you shall eat it with unleavened bread, the bread of affliction, for you came out of the land of Egypt in haste, so that you may remember all the days of your life, the day when you came out of the land of Egypt. For 7 days no leaven shall be seen with you in all your territory, and none of the flesh which you sacrifice on the evening of the first day shall remain overnight until morning. You are not allowed to sacrifice the Passover in any of your towns which Yahweh your Elohim is giving you, but at the place where Yahweh your Elohim chooses to establish his name, you shall sacrifice the Passover in the evening at sunset, at the time that you came out of Egypt. You shall cook and eat it in the place which Yahweh your Elohim chooses. In the morning you are to return to your tents. 6 days you shall eat unleavened bread, and on the seventh day there shall be a solemn assembly to Yahweh your Elohim. You shall do no work on it. That's a lot, but that's basically the whole thing, right? From the Old Testament about what we're doing. So the bread of affliction, that's the first part of that I want to talk about. And that's the topic today, but I'm putting a spin on it, calling it the bread of chaos. The word for affliction is oni, which means misery, poverty, depression, and affliction. It is supposed to be a chore to eat this bread. It's supposed to be something undesirable to do, okay? We're all laughing because last night that we fulfilled that commandment last night. Okay. But that's okay because it's exactly what we were supposed to do. We were supposed to have made some bread in haste that was bland and tough, and that's what they ate. So it was very authentic. And it has to be unusual and a break from the norm. Yahweh uses food throughout the Old Testament to mark time, to mark events, to mark stuff. And Yeshua uses food all the time in his parables. The Bible is an agrarian-based book. So when we look at the way that food is used, these are sermon upon sermon upon sermon, right? Throwing out your starter lump is an absurd thing to do to the Gentiles. It's absurd. It's not something that anybody would ever be like, gosh, I want to start that over. Some people have starter lumps that have been passed down from grandma to grandma to grandma to grandma, right? And it's like an honor thing to have one, like an heirloom. So for Paul to go teach the Gentiles to throw out their starter lump and start with unleavened bread, who would do this? Why would you do this, right? So we start by using something different. But then we also think about the societal aspect of it. In Jerusalem, in Israel, during these days, you could not find a muffin. It wouldn't exist. The entire nation would have done exactly the same thing. That's a very important thing for us to understand, is that the Torah applies to everybody equally, right? Everybody's under this sin, and everybody's under grace, and everybody's does the same exact thing. Other places in the Bible where food is used is in Joseph in Egypt. And Yahweh, what does he do? He says, you're going to have 7 years of plenty, then you're going to have 7 years of famine. So gives it to Joseph in order to do what? In order to make Egypt an incredibly wealthy and hospitable place, and force Jacob to have to go there, right? Think about how many people, millions of people were affected in order to get one family to go to Egypt, right? So that Joseph could be in charge of the entire thing. It's an amazing thing. What did that also do? Well, that also made Egypt remarkably wealthy and powerful. They owned everything. Because as you know, gold doesn't matter. You cannot eat it. You can't eat gold. You can't eat silver. You can't eat dwellings. You have to have food and water to survive. So we think about these things throughout time and how the food is used in the Bible. Now, what we don't see in English is in English, there's the word bread. And then you have to have an adjective. If it's an adjective, it's sourdough bread, wheat bread, rye bread, unleavened bread, right? But in Hebrew and in Greek, they have words for totally different words for bread and unleavened bread. And so that's what the teaching, I have those words up there. You shall not eat leavened bread, chametz, with it, and you shall eat it with unleavened bread, matzah. Totally different word, right? And the bread of affliction, lechem, is actually, in this case, is adjective bread, because lechem is the bread that, like regular bread, right? But the different types is chametz equals, in Hebrew, is zume in Greek, which means yeast or leavened bread. Sior is zume in Greek, which means leavened bread. Lechem equals artos, which equals bread. In Greek, if you see artos by itself, it's saying leavened bread. And matzah is unleavened bread, which is azumos. So if zume is yeast, azumos means not yeast, right? So it's pretty easy to see if we were to read this in Greek or Hebrew. And the reason I bring it up is because if you look at the Last Supper in a couple Gospels, it's referred to as eating the Passover. But if we were reading it in Greek, we would never assume that they were eating the Passover because they didn't eat unleavened bread. They had regular old bread at the Last Supper. And we would never even get that confusion, which is why I bring all that up. So this renewal that we do, the getting rid of the leavening as they left Egypt. What were they doing when they left Egypt? They were leaving their old lives behind. Another aspect of this renewal is that you are making a decision, right? You had to make a decision to leave Egypt. God will call you and he will teach you and he will nudge you, but ultimately you're the one who has to make the decision to go. They made the decision to go. They made the decision to not bring their bread and bring their stuff with them. And then it makes a new year. So removing the leavening, making a new lump teaches us lessons, and it starts a cycle, a pattern from which to grow. So Todd got to witness us tear up our house and search for leavening this year for the first time. Strange practice if you've never done it before. Strange times indeed, as we move all of our furniture from one room of the house to the other, and it just turns into a disaster, right? Because it's not like the house is clean. The house is clean when you're done, but it's a disaster, right? Because everything's all cast here and there. And then the second we're done cleaning it, what do? We make it worse by baking a bunch of messy bread, right? So this cycle, these traditions, which aren't really traditions or commandments in this case, it teaches us, it really brings us into the culture of Yahweh. Using food shows that we have to trust God for our sustenance. This is something that we in the West cannot fathom. We just can't. We just don't have it, right? What did we have when we started planning our Seder? It was a question we asked. What are we going to eat? We live in the United States of America, Kansas City, relatively peaceful, prosperous place. We can have any food we want at any time we want. We can have a papaya from South America. We could have hummus from the Middle East. We could have anything we want. The wine I drank last night was from Chile, right? The wine that everybody else drank was from Israel, right? We have whatever we want here. In real biblical times. We've only been able to live like this now since the fall of the Berlin Wall, really, since 91, right? Before then, we was a good country and we had a lot of everything. But once that Berlin Wall fell, then the whole world became international trade was the norm. And then we can get anything at anywhere at any time, right? That's going to go away at some point. At some point, we're going to have to go back to being restricted to just what's around us. Living in Kansas City, that's not a bad place to be. There's no shortage of grain here. There's no shortage of fruit, vegetables, cattle. We live in a good place. The people who live in the desert are good luck. You'd be fighting over a turtle. I mean, there's nothing out there. Armadillo, sagebrush, there's nothing out there. So throwing out the lump, and this is part of the bread of chaos, part of it, is that you have to trust that your life is going to be peaceful enough to make a new starter lump. Think about Ukraine right now. Think about that war. Do you think that somebody is baking bread in there right now? They're not. They're eating whatever they find, probably the moment they find it. They're starving in Mariupol. They have no food. They have no peace. They're in pure chaos. So when you have the ability to make a starter lump, which takes about 2 weeks, I've done it a few times. I was thinking about doing it again this year. Takes about 2 weeks to get a starter lump going. You have to mix flour. Well, if our processed flour, it may take less time with raw flour, but you have to take flour and water and you let it sit in the sunlight for about 12 hours. And then you cut it in half, you add flour and water, and you let it sit in the sunlight for 12 hours until it starts doubling and tripling in size. You can reduce the timing, and then you have to go and take the starter lump and make a loaf out of it, where it takes time and peace. You can't do that if you're running away from enemies. If it's chaotic, you can't make that kind of food. Now, here in America, we have right? The days of unleavened bread are over. We're just going to go and, go to the store and buy whatever we want to buy, right? It's over. But that's not the way it worked in the biblical times. And again, the unleavened bread is a chore. Even here in the U.S. in 21st century, what do we have? I did it myself. I caught myself doing it, and it's not bad, but I bought some honey to put on my unleavened bread this week. And we've got that hazelnut stuff. Nutella. Yeah. We got enough of that to give a tribe diabetes laying around at our house, right? We have all of this. So we have this comfort of the West is so big that we don't fathom what these people are doing. And not in our towns. That's the other part of this I want to touch on, right? When they left Egypt, they had that first Passover, which was a singular event. It was the book of Exodus. It's not called Exodus in Hebrew. It's called Shemot, which means names. It's called names because it starts with the names of the people who entered Egypt, right? The beginning of the nation. That's a singular event. There's a thing today where they start talking about a second Exodus, and I just have to go, what are you talking about, right? We are not going to have another 70 people go into Egypt and grow into a mighty nation and get chased out and get the commandments. That's just not going to happen again. That was a very singular and special time in order to bring us along in the plan of salvation. We're a lot further along of that now. We're 3,000 years down the road on that part of it. So what happened was, they had the 10 plagues, with the 10th plague taking out the firstborn. Brutal. Egypt is in complete ruins. Their firstborn's dead, which means their dukes, their lords, their princes, their managers, all just lost their next generation of leadership. Right? It's not babies. They're talking about firstborn. They're talking about all the firstborn are gone. right? The cattle are destroyed. The crops are eaten up. The water turned to blood and back, right? This nation is destroyed. They get chased out. Red Sea closes up and wipes out their military. Now they can't even go steal from other people to rebuild their country. They're wiped out. And now you have the Hebrews are locked on a different side. They were talking about going back. You can't go back. Do you think Yahweh was going to open that ocean for you again? You can't go back. You make the decision to go, you're gone, and you're liable for whatever happens. So then we're still in the book of Exodus, right? We're still talking about Shemot. Then they get to the base of Mount Sinai, and they get the commandments. What a wonderful time. We're not getting the commandments again like that. We've got them in the book, right? We have them. And then they keep, 1 year later, they keep the Passover as a memorial. Then, so they did the original one in Exodus 12. Then they keep the Passover at the base of Mount Sinai. They don't do it again until they enter the land. This is little known stuff, but a lot of the commandments says when you enter the land, you're going to do this stuff. When you're out of the land, what do? The Bible doesn't really tell us. We have to kind of do our best, which is what we're doing here today, right? We can't keep Passover, and it's unclear if we even would, because Yeshua died as the Lamb of God. He fulfilled that day, right? But we do know the first century believers continued to use the temple. Paul went to the temple, paid his oath. He was going to take a Nazirite vow. He was going to do an oath, right? So we know they continue to use it, but it's unclear what's going to happen in the future. So today, we can't do it, but we want to. Our desire to be close to God shows our heart. And the fact that we can't is kind of our teaching type stuff. So we're practicing and doing the best we can for whatever happens when the Messiah comes back. So, Exodus 12. The Egyptians urged the people to send them out of the land in haste, for they said, "We will all be dead." So the people took their dough before it was leavened, and with their kneading bowls bound up in the clothes on their shoulders. Now the sons of Israel had done according to the word of Moses, but they had requested from the Egyptians articles of silver and articles of gold and clothing, and the Lord had given the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, so that they let them have their request. Thus they plundered the Egyptians. Now the sons of Israel journeyed from Ramses to Sukkot, about 600,000 men on foot, aside from children. A mixed multitude also went up with them, along with flocks and herds, a very large number of livestock. They baked the dough which they had brought out of Egypt into cakes of unleavened bread, for it had not become leavened, since they were driven out of Egypt and could not delay, nor had they prepared any provisions for themselves. There is so much here, okay? What were they when they were leaving? They were slaves. They just got paid for all their work. They were owed all that money. They were taken advantage of, depending on how you count it, 300 to 400 years. They were completely subservient slaves, and they got justice. They got paid for all that labor. What did they do with all of that material? Right? They go to the base of Mount Sinai, and, well, okay, they did the bad thing. They made the golden calf. That one got ground up and destroyed, right? But the rest of it was used to build the tabernacle. The rest of that wealth was used to start the Levitical priesthood. So Yahweh uses Joseph to starve the world so that 70 people go into Egypt, so that 2 million can come out. There's 600,000 men, plus their women and children, plus the mixed multitude. It's approximately 2 million people leaving and bringing everything with them. They were thrown a parade to get out. That's a miracle. And they got out. And then the Egyptians had been brought to their knees. so bad that they were begging for this people to leave. They knew that the God of the Hebrews was more powerful than all their gods. And they said, you know what? Maybe we'll quit dying if we just get rid of you people. Get out. And they got out. Didn't get better for Egypt. They lost their army after that, but it did Yahweh's will. And so the commemoration is for this. The commemoration is to remember that Yahweh saved 2 million people, were his people, and didn't know it. He saved them before they knew who they were. What does the New Testament say? While we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. Before we knew what we were, Christ died for us. Same thing. These patterns continue to flow, right? They were sinners. They were lost. They didn't know who they were, to the point that they had to be chased out of the country in order to become this special people. And then we learn from that as we come and become adopted into that family. They knew they were different from the Egyptians. Remember, they lived in Goshen, right? The pasture land. The Egyptians didn't like the pasture land. They didn't like to live with the animals. Don't know why. They had their customs. They knew they were different. They didn't know how different. They didn't know what they were supposed to be doing. But they knew they were different. And then when the time was right, Yahweh saved them and preserved them in chaos. Pure, unadulterated chaos. Think about the weeping, the lamenting, all the dead people, and the Egyptians looking at the Hebrews going, none of this happened to you. They were right there with them, preserved, as all the plagues happened, as the frogs and the blood and the firstborn, they're in it and they're preserved. I want you to understand that, because in the end times, when things go bad, we're not going to be saving ourselves in the country. We might live in the country if that's where you choose to live, but the believers are going to be right next to the other people, being preserved miraculously, not raptured up, being saved right along with them. These patterns continue, and it's real. And just think about the chaos. Think about the scene. 2 million people leaving on foot, with people just shoveling gold and silver on them as they go to get out. The dead bodies, the rotting carcasses of the frogs and the grasshoppers and whatever else, the famine and all of that. Think about how scary of a time that must have been. Think about, and those who knew to go, they didn't go. What does the New Testament say? When you have to get out of Jerusalem, you do not go back to get your coat. When it's time to go, you go. And they left with no food. They just said, oh, it's time to go. And and there were a lot of people in that mixed multitude who saw those Hebrews leaving and said, you know what? The unknown is better than this. I'm jumping in that caravan and I'm going with them. And those people became part of Israel. When it was at the Mount Sinai and the 10 Commandments went out, it went out to the mixed multitude, and there's never any mention of these people separating or breaking off or being treated differently. So these are people who were saved before they knew to be saved. They even shirked their identity, as Tiffany said about the golden calf, right? They tried to blow it over and over and over, don't we all? Right? We all try to blow it, and we all mess up. He's not done with us. He's got a mission for us. We've got something to do. So let's talk about this day today, because today is Abib 15 on the Hebrew calendar. Yeshua died on Abib 14 at sunset, and they wanted to get his body off the cross because that Sabbath was a high day. Okay? So this is one of the reasons we do all this Torah studying, so that we can understand one sentence in the New Testament, okay? One sentence, one phrase. Then the Jews, because it was the day of preparation, So Abib 14 is the day that you prepare for the Passover when the lambs are slaughtered, so that the bodies would not remain on the cross on the Sabbath, for that Sabbath was a high day. Asked Pilate that their legs might be broken and that they might be taken away. So Yeshua was supposed to die on the 14th, but he was crucified on the 14th. Crucifixion usually takes a long time to kill somebody. So how do they resolve that? Resolved it by having him stabbed at the end of the day. Terrible. What does the Old Testament say? He was pierced through for our transgressions. How could the Messiah die on a cross and be stabbed at the same time? Here you go. Right? It's pretty brutal to think about, right? But you have to reconcile the prophecies, do our apologetics. And so today is that day. Their rabbi, their sorrow. Imagine, remember I was just talking about when people knew it was time to go, they just go, right? He had 12 apostles and at least 500 people, other people, that were just following him around everywhere. Imagine walking around with this guy who's so kind and so gentle and so knowledgeable and can heal people and resurrect people and is just this wonderful human being, could do everything, knew everything, and your mind is, that's our king, because he was the king. Right? When they crucified him, what did it say above his head? Melech Yehudim, behold the king of the Jews. They wanted him to be the king right then. Who wouldn't want that guy to be the king? Right? I guess the people who killed him didn't want him to be the king because he was going to take away their power. And he was going to return the power to the people. Right? He was going to get rid of all this specialness. So they're walking around with him. And the love and the knowledge and the acceptance and the forgiveness, the things that the other leaders were unwilling to give. The other leaders wouldn't even dine with a sinner. This guy all his pals are sinners. And he's there. It's wonderful. And then they go into Jerusalem and they put down the palms. He goes in on a colt. They're bringing him in like a king. This is great. Guys, who's going to sit on your right hand? Who's going to be your right-hand man, Jesus? Who's going to be your right-hand man, Yeshua? You're coming now, right? Well, yeah, they killed him. What do you think? On this day, he's dead. What do you think is going on with the apostles? Chaos. Absolute chaos. Sorrow. What is the bread of affliction? Remember, I read the definitions earlier. Depression, anxiety, sorrow, sadness. They were all eating unleavened bread. Remember, I said in Jerusalem, there's not going to be a muffin in Jerusalem during the days of unleavened bread. They're eating the bread of affliction while the Messiah is in the tomb. They're weeping. They're lost. They're literally lost. They left all their jobs, their family, everything behind to follow the Messiah. And now he's dead. And they have nothing. They don't know what to do. It's very sad. It's not a coincidence that this is also the day that Egypt was mourning the death of their firstborn. Do you think Yahweh might have been mourning the death of his son up in heaven? Just saying. Both proud and sad. Proud that his son went through with it, and sad that the people actually killed the Messiah. And it's not Jews or Romans. They both did it. That's why he goes back and forth between Herod and Pilate. That's why they put the Jewish guard on the tomb. Both parties are responsible because he died for the sins of anybody who will accept him as the Messiah. Anybody. It had to be both so that all of us have a pathway to salvation. Guess what he would have eaten when he was resurrected? This festival is a week long. Unleavened bread. So we're eating the same bread as the risen Messiah. That makes it a little bit more meaningful than just going through commandment after commandment, right? Makes it a little more special. I don't think so, but he ate. Yeah, maybe he had to have the fish, right? I'm assuming he had the bread, right? But even if he didn't have the bread, they had the bread, right? He was still keeping the commandments. And what's the other parallel? The apostles were lost for 3 days and 3 nights. Those priests, elders, scribes wanted to kill them too. They were completely unscathed. They were untouched. They were protected. Even when they were lost and they were completely helpless, they were protected in the chaos. So, what about today? But realize that that in the last days, difficult times will come, for men will be lovers of self, lovers of money, boastful, arrogant, revilers, disobedient to parents, ungrateful, unholy, unloving, irreconcilable, malicious gossips, without self-control, brutal, haters of good, treacherous, reckless, conceited, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, holding to a form of godliness, although they have denied its power. Avoid such men as these, for among them are those who enter into households and captivate weak women, weighed down with sins, led on by various impulses, always learning and never able to come to the truth. So do we trust him enough to lead our lives like he's in control? I don't know that I could say that. It's hard to give up control, isn't it? It's hard to give up the pleasures of the world and the planning and the thinking, because we have to do both. And it doesn't work out, it's up to him. So are the believers going to be unscathed in the end times? Yes and no. Some are. Some aren't. Some are going to be martyred and plagued and, bad stuff. It doesn't really matter, though, because unlike the Egyptians, we know the prize. The prize is the next life. The prize is the resurrection. The prize is the new Jerusalem. The prize is the full restoration of all things. So we know. They didn't know. When they left, they had no idea that they were going to go and have this beautiful land and all this stuff. We have an idea. What's going to be like for us to keep Passover and unleavened bread as things get worse? It's going to be hard. But guess what? It's possible, right? He didn't command us to have exotic food that we can't obtain. The commandment is unleavened bread. As long as you can grow wheat and have water, you can keep it. It's going to be hard. The world's going to be violent, increasingly godless. That's not too hard to imagine now today, is it? What's going on in the world? It's pretty bad. What are we going to be doing, though, when that happens? So the dragon was enraged with the woman and went off to make war with the rest of her children who keep the commandments of Yahweh and hold to the testimony of Yeshua. Just going to keep keeping those commandments, believing in Yeshua as long as we can. Right? All right. That's all I got for today.